Good morning. My name is Tara, and I would like to thank you for attending this morning's Dharma family service. We will begin this service with a moment of quiet sitting. Reverend C.J. Dunford will strike the bell, and we will sit for 1 or 2 minutes to quiet our minds and prepare to hear the Dharma. Then they will strike the bell again, and we will continue with the service.
Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namandab, 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 Namandab.
Reverend C.J. Dunford will lead us in the chanting of the Shoshinge.
門心如来具世願仏言古代小下者善人用運打理家弥陀仏本願念仏邪見教満なく衆生信行十字人に難中死難昔陰の祭天使論下中華自治域史構想現代小構成小異妙如来本勢置き釈迦如来両河線一種五妙難天竺龍樹大寺主等世質の財派有無権先絶大乗無情報召喚義事小安楽賢人難行六六信行異様指導楽億年弥陀仏本願自年即時入筆上唯の上昇如来語大大偶然天神菩薩増論説奇妙無下光如来永衆たら見真実公然の超大誓願公有本願力へ公異道群上昇維新記入独大の会筆逆入大へ収集特使連で造世界即昇信用法精進有本の信玄人図入法寺音寺用下本師鈍乱両天使上皇乱消防殺来三蔵ルシ十条教凡上専用気楽法天神菩薩論中下報道因果見世願大言ねこゆたり少女死因有信心惑千本部新人ポツ小内小内即涅槃非死無量光明道小異修上配布家同社結晶道難所有名浄土活入安全自力変言宗円満特語感染症三不三神慶音言増末法滅道品一生増悪非偶税死安如外小妙化全道徳妙武将公愛上三四逆悪光明妙語見 大地海有者小樹看護心表記一年そうごよい大東逆三人即所保障市場楽原神公開一大慶雨返帰安養官に祭先祖死有心反先人法華二度小弁に極地悪人唯小仏が薬剤費摂取自由煩悩証言水福権大無権上長が本資源苦名部慶雨連民全幕凡部人新宗慶書公編集先弱本願愚悪性現内生じ臨伝下ケチ議場一生親友即入学上無意楽一信心いのにゆく兄弟事主子問う上妻無変極上悪同族自主愚道心有意可信し高創生 나만다부 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 간니시그도그 묘도세이사이 노호즈모다히신 오조 안나코 나만답 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 나만답
Please join us in singing the Gatha, Amita's Guiding Light.
Does light, wisdom true and bright, guiding us through unending to life. Does light, shining clear and bright. Gratefully we say Namo Amida Butsu. Wisdom true and bright, guiding us through unending to life. Is light, shining clear and bright. Gratefully we say Namo Amida Butsu. Amida's guiding light.
Please join me in reciting the Golden Chain 2. Golden Chain 2. I am a link in the Buddha's golden chain of love that stretches around the world. I must keep my link bright and strong. I will try to be kind and gentle to every living thing and protect all who are weaker than myself. I will try to think pure and beautiful thoughts, to say pure and beautiful words, and to do pure and beautiful deeds, knowing that on what I do now depends not only my happiness or unhappiness, but also that of others. May every link in the Buddha's golden chain of love become bright and strong, and may we all attain perfect peace. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda. We will now have a Dharma message by Reverend C.J. Dunford.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'd like to start my message with the words of our founder, Shinran. I hope that everyone will, deeply entrusting themselves to the Nembutsu, and firmly embracing prayers for peace in this world, in their hearts, together say the Nembutsu. It would be splendid if all people who say the Nembutsu do so not with thoughts of themselves, but for the sake of the imperial court and for the sake of the people of this country. Those who feel uncertain of birth should say Nembutsu, aspiring first for their own birth. Those who feel that their own birth is settled should, mindful of the Buddha's benevolence, hold the Nembutsu in their hearts and say it to respond in gratitude to that benevolence, with the wish, may there be peace in the world and may the Buddha's teaching spread. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, 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 namanda. The quote that I just shared for today's Gosandai comes from a letter written by our founder, Venerable Shinran, in response to a correspondence from a member of the Nembutsu community. In Shinran's letter, his implicit response is one of concern regarding the harassment and the discrimination that the Nembutsu community was facing at the time. There were several instances of governmental and institutional suppression of the Sangha at the time, and this Sangha looked very different from what it does today. There was no honganji or organized temple structure, nor was there a strong sense of community that was centered around the temples. There wasn't a lot of political power or a strong sense of community in the Nembutsu community. However, their gatherings were all held in local homes or in maybe small temples. But by and large, the Nembutsu movement was seen as a populist threat by both the powerful and established institutions and by the aristocracy at the time. As a result of this fear, it was common for those with power to persecute the Nembutsu community. Today I want to talk about the importance of justice in Buddhism. I chose this topic for several reasons. The first of which is that today marks the last day that our mother temple, Nishi Honganji in Japan, is celebrating Honko, or the special memorial for our founder, Venerable Shinran, who lived from 1173 to 1263 in Japan. This year marks his 759th memorial. Shinran was no stranger to injustice during his time. And while we celebrate most of his work in terms of scholarly Buddhist pursuits, if we look at his pastoral letters to his community, we find a heart that longs for interpersonal and social change. The quote I just shared for today's Gosandai is Shinran's thoughtful response to the religious and governmental persecution of his community of friends and family. On this slide, I'm sharing a portion of Shinran's magnum opus, the Kyogyo Shinsho, which is a deep hermeneutical analysis of Pure Land Buddhism. However, towards the end of his work, Shinran waxes emotional, reflecting on his own life, some of the difficulties that he's faced along the way, and gratitude for his teachers. In this particular passage, he directly criticizes the imperial court and the Buddhist institutions who unjustly persecuted his master and his disciples, which included Shinran. He states, "Scholars of the Chinese classics in the capital are confused about practices and wholly unable to differentiate between right and wrong paths. Thus, scholar monks of Kofukuji presented a petition to the retired emperor on the first part of the second month of 1207. The emperor and his ministers acted against the Dharma and violated human rectitude, became enraged and embittered. As a result, Master Genku, the eminent founder who had enabled the true essence of the Pure Land Way to spread vigorously, and a number of his followers, without receiving any deliberation of their alleged crimes, were summarily sentenced to death or were disposed of their monkhood, given secular names, and consigned to distant banishment. I was among the latter, hence I am now neither monk nor one of worldly life." Leveling this sort of critique against the government and a powerful Buddhist institution could have given Shinran a lot of trouble. In making this statement, he was risking his freedom and perhaps even his life to speak out against injustice. Shinran could not be quiet. The second reason that I wanted to talk about justice in Buddhism is that tomorrow, January 17th, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day in the United States. There are a number of insightful and creative leaders in the pursuit of justice here. And most often we think of Martin Luther King as a paragon of that work during the postmodern era in the United States. King was a Baptist minister, a passionate public speaker, and an insightful visionary on building communities of resistance founded on nonviolence as a means of achieving justice and peace. I want to point out the significance of his collaborative work as an essential component of peace building, and more broadly, movements that advocate for equality and justice. King was inspired by the work of Gandhi and had gone to India to visit him. Gandhi and his supporters achieved Indian liberation from the British Empire through civil disobedience and nonviolence. He also met Thich Nhat Hanh in the 60s and was inspired by the young monk's devotion to peace and ending the disastrous war in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese people suffered much. You see, King may have been a Baptist preacher, and he was certainly grounded in the teachings of Jesus. However, he sought a broader coalition building and his visioning of common goals that every person could pursue. He worked with people like Hindus and Buddhists. He recognized the wisdom, insight, and hard work of other communities who had been violently oppressed for many generations. And he saw these communities as an inspiration for pursuing racial justice in the United States. In many ways, in spite of our religious differences, we could say that King sought to live in accord with the teachings of pratitya samuppada, or dependent co-arising. That is to say that we are all reliant on one another as a community of humanity. Every action that we take affects not only ourselves, but also our close communities, and even out into the world beyond, like ripples in a pond. When this activity holds an intent to liberate ourselves and others from injustice, violence, and oppression, then it becomes a movement toward collective liberation, which in Buddhism we would say is a step toward enlightenment. Reverend King also found strong conscious conviction to align his values of nonviolence in critiquing state-sponsored violence beyond the domestic hatred and marginalization of the Black community. But he also critiqued military violence and a particularly American love of war that seeks to dominate and subjugate the very earth. In talking about his opposition to the U.S.'s participation in the war in Vietnam, King states, "It grows out of my experience of the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially in the last 3 summers. As I've walked among the desperate, rejected, angry young men, I've told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I've tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change must come meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of these boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. To actively seek peace, to root out hatred and violence, is an immensely difficult task, which requires deep insight and understanding of the causes and conditions which create injustice. King admits a profound change in his approach toward nonviolence, from trying to correct those who would utilize weapons in his community to understanding the reasons why they would want to or need to utilize these tools to protect themselves. He saw this violence as a cycle that begins at the state level through unending war and terror, which is often sold to us as war on terror. Dr. King quotes a Vietnamese Buddhist leader who said of the war in Vietnam, quote, "Each day the war goes on, the hatred increases in the heart of the Vietnamese and in the hearts of those with humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. It is curious that the Americans, who calculate so carefully on the possibilities of military victory, do not realize that in this process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but the image of violence and militarism." End quote. War and imperialism are systems of violence and hatred grounded in discriminative thinking, judging some people, communities, nations, and their lives, perspectives, their struggles and realities as more valuable, more legitimate than others. This is a tale as old as human civilization. Buddhism teaches us that this notion of cycles is the natural order of the cosmos. That's how samsara works. We're born and die again and again until we break the cycle of self-centeredness and awaken to our interdependence. As part of this cosmological understanding, we find ourselves stuck in the cycles of harm. Oftentimes, this cycle is presented as quote-unquote justice in secular terms, which means moral codes of law that establish levels of crime or harm and their commensurate punishments. Many of us accept these cycles of crime and punishment as how the world works or how it must work. However, Buddhism teaches us that this cycle of violence will only repeat itself. The law of karma forces us to understand the causes and conditions that lie at the root of violence. And the primal vow of equality urges us to address these roots of violence through changing our behavior. We cannot live in a world of peace if we simply return pain and hatred with punishment. This leads to escalation and only greater harm to our communities. The whole concept of the Pure Land in our tradition and following the path of Namo Amida Butsu requires us to think imaginatively about how our world may be. This is to say that the call of Amida Buddha for us to awaken to birth in the land of bliss is a call for us to awaken to the injustice of the world, a call for us to pursue justice in this world, to treat our fellow beings with kindness and respect, to seek healing rather than retribution, to seek understanding and patience rather than punishment. Shinran says that for those who have long said the Nembutsu and taken refuge in the vow of ultimate equality, there are signs of rejecting the evils of the world. Depending on our understanding of the Dharma and the roots of suffering that leads to a change in this very life, and we need not think of Buddha and birth in the Pure Land as something distant and far off. For Buddha is constantly in a state of becoming in our hearts and in our minds. This is the meaning of entrusting ourselves to the Nembutsu and embracing prayers for peace in the world and our hearts. Our founder, Venerable Shinran, was a bodhisattva who witnessed great injustice in the world, but also saw potential for us to awaken to a creative society of peace. Similarly, Dr. King was a bodhisattva who recognized the deep-rooted evil in humanity's hearts, along with the hope that we could all hold hands together in beloved community of equality. All of this means that we see that we cannot be silent in the face of injustice, of violence and inequality. Change only happens when we speak up and take meaningful action. Change happens when we can no longer be silent. I would like to conclude my Dharma message for today by reading the words of our Venerable Shinran once more. Please join me in Gassho. I hope that everyone will, deeply entrusting themselves to the Nembutsu and firmly embracing prayers for peace in the world in their hearts, together say the Nembutsu. It would be splendid if all people who say the Nembutsu do so not with thoughts of themselves, but for the people of this country, the imperial court. Those who feel uncertain of birth should say the Nembutsu, aspiring first for their own birth. Those who feel that their own birth is settled should, mindful of the Buddha's benevolence, hold the Nembutsu in their hearts and say it to respond in gratitude to that benevolence, with the wish, may there be peace in the world, and may the Buddha's teaching spread. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, 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 namanda. The Dharma School students will now be dismissed to their Zoom classes. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for service. I'd especially like to thank Tara Umemoto for being our chairperson today. I'd like to thank Bradley, Myron, and Vernon for their help during today's live streaming service. Also, thank you, Tara, for monitoring the chat room and our YouTube channel. I'd like to thank Emiko and the music team for the beautiful music, and for the gatha. Thank you. And also thank you to everyone who joined the service today. We have some announcements that should show on the screen right now. Today, immediately after service, we'll have an online yoga session. Wednesday, January 19th at 7 p.m., we'll have our evening meditation. On Thursday, January 27th at 6:30 p.m., the BBT monthly service, or the monthly study session Dharma will happen with a topic on Shinjin. And finally, on Friday 28th at 6 p.m., we'll have the college welcome night. Thanks again for coming today.